Maybe we can just go back 1 year when President Putin made demands on the Western countries, especially the United States. And they were stop the enlargement of NATO, was the most basic of all. Do not try to move NATO forces, a US-led military alliance, into Ukraine and into Georgia, as all US governments since 2008 have committed to do. There were two other issues that Putin put on the table regarding Ukraine. One was Russia's continued hold on Crimea. That has a big story to it, of course. And the second was a resolution of the crisis in the Donbass, which was always a point of difficulty in Ukraine since independence, actually, because of the very high proportion of ethnic Russians living in eastern Ukraine in the two Donbass oblasts. And in 2015, after the first phase of this war had broken out, there was the Minsk II agreement to try to address the Donbass crisis. And Putin was saying Ukraine didn't implement that. Europe, which was guarantor of the agreement, didn't guarantee the agreement. This needs to be solved. So all in all, a year ago, three issues were put on the table. Those same issues were on the table in March, when it looked like Russia and Ukraine would reach some kind of agreement about a month after the invasion started on February 24th. Of course, one can go back many years to key events that were part of why these three issues loom so large, back to 2014, when a pro-Russian president was overthrown in an insurrection, in effect, in which the U.S. government participated. One can go back to 2008, when George W. Bush Jr. at the Bucharest NATO summit said and pushed all of the other members of NATO to commit to expanding NATO to Ukraine and Georgia. Or you could take it back to 1990, when the United States and Germany in particular promised to President Mikhail Gorbachev that as the Soviet Union was disbanding its military alliance, the so-called Warsaw Pact, NATO would not take advantage of that. And the famous phrase of the time was that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. So you could view this crisis as having many antecedents. It has been building for years. The one thing I would advise everybody to understand very well is that the rhetoric in the mainstream Western media, that this is an unprovoked war that started on February 24th, 2022, is simply not accurate or helpful in understanding what's happening. The war actually broke out in February 2014, first of all, and it has many antecedents. And to recognize that is very helpful, because it helps to understand how we can get out of this mess. Danny, I don't hear you. I think.
Sorry about that. I was muted. Yes, indeed. And I wanted to follow up on all that you said, because the Western mainstream media, U.S. mainstream media, just like U.S. foreign policy, is in laser focused on Russia and China and spreading a lot of misinformation. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think is really behind this aggressive posture that the United States has taken toward Russia in relation to Ukraine and of course, the region at large, and then China as well in Asia? What is behind this, do you think?
Again, it depends where you start the story, but the anti-Russia feelings go back a century or more. In the United Kingdom, definitely 2 centuries. So there's a very long undercurrent of anti-Russian sentiment. And during the Cold War, Russia and the Soviet Union were equated. At the end of the Cold War, in a way, Russia was equated with what had been the Soviet Union in the American policymakers' mind. Russia was seen as an imperialist competitor of the United States, which is itself an expansionist power in many, many ways. We're the only country that has 800 overseas military bases in 80 countries, and American policymakers like to be everywhere. They like to meddle everywhere. They want to make sure that every government everywhere is friendly to U.S. interests, and if it's not, they often try to take out those governments. So the collisions have been going on for a very long time. Now, I myself personally came into this story 33 years ago when President Gorbachev, a magnificent person and a great statesman, was ending the Cold War by basically saying that the Central and Eastern European countries could go their way with democracy and elections. This was taking place step by step. I became the advisor to the Polish government, the first post-communist Polish government in August 1989. And in 1990, I became an advisor to President Gorbachev's economic team. And I was inspired by Gorbachev's vision that we just needed a common home from Rotterdam to Vladivostok, was how he put it, from Western Europe to the very eastern end of this vast Soviet Union. And in 1990 and 91, I tried to mobilize financial help to the Soviet Union, which was in a very deep financial crisis and spiraling downward. Yet Gorbachev was democratizing and reforming. So I said, this is an occasion where financial help would make sense. That didn't happen. The idea was rejected by the White House and by the West. Then the Soviet Union was ended in December 1991, excuse me. And I became an economic advisor to President Yeltsin. And I had one main assignment, which was to try to help with financial stabilization, again, by trying to mobilize the kind of financial support that the West had given to Poland. But I discovered, to my great consternation, the White House wasn't interested in helping Russia at the time. The White House was interested in a new unipolar world. It wasn't interested in accommodation. Of course, there were different factions and forces at work in U.S. foreign policy, but this is really the rise of the neoconservatives. The neoconservatives are the group that ideologically believes that the United States should basically predominate in every region of the world. It should call the shots. It should set the rules. It should not have any peer competitors in any region. And even what these neocons think are second-rate powers like Russia, which is an expression in effect that Obama used during his presidency, referring to Russia. They don't want those competitors. And what we're seeing right now, both vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis China, is a U.S. neoconservative dominated foreign policy, which is based on the premise that if there are powerful countries that are not under the U.S. umbrella, part of NATO or part of some other U.S. alliance, and indeed that are not very friendly with the U.S.-led idea, that those countries are antagonists. So they actually are turned into enemies, not merely other countries, but enemies. And that's the process that has been underway in a kind of self-fulfilling way vis-a-vis Russia and China. With Russia, we refuse to listen to 30 years of Russia saying, please, you said NATO was not going to move. Do not move NATO. This is not consistent with our security. We don't want you on our border. You call yourself a defense alliance. We don't quite see it that way because we see how often you're trying to change regimes and meddle in other countries' politics. So whatever you call it, we have our own ideas. Please stay away from our border. We rejected that all along. Who are you to tell us not to be wherever we want to be around you? So that was on the one side. And on the other side, we're absolutely creating an enemy of China. And I've watched this very close up since really around 2015, where the US policymakers suddenly got the idea that, well, China produces our iPhones and that's good. And they changed the idea to, oh, China's going to take over the world and that's bad. Now we have to contain China's rise. And so they're pulling out the old anti-Soviet playbook and trying to apply it to China. What this is doing in both cases is creating terrible global tensions, and in the case of Russia, a devastating war in which I interpret it as Ukraine being caught in the middle. Of course, the Ukrainian leaders don't share my way of describing it. My Ukrainian friends do not. They say this is just pure Russian aggression. I suppose I can understand their sentiment, but I don't see it that way from a historical point of view that I have watched very closely for more than 30 years. I see one step after another where we refuse to tamp down the rising direct collision course that we were on.
Well, I wanted to follow up that with your your take on China in particular, because you've been to China, you've spoken out a lot about China's rise, and you talked a lot just now about what the U.S. is saying about China, how it's demonizing China, and then creating this very dangerous policy agenda around this. What do people need to know about China, do you think, to deconstruct this misinformation that they're getting about China? Because, it feels like a lot of the U.S. population in particular has, only heard one side. They've only heard this kind of new Cold War orientation, but from the mainstream media, from their political class. What do you think people need to know about China to understand China's rise better?
And just to say, not only have I been to China, I've been to China frequently since 1981, so that's 41 years now, often going many times a year with many former students who are in senior positions in government or in other parts of the economy, with the many discussions and study groups and academic work and conferences. So I've been watching China, and I've been rooting for China's escape from poverty for 4 decades. When I first went to China in 1981, China was impoverished. And that was both striking and sad. It was also, I knew as an economist in development economics, anomalous from a long-term perspective, because for a lot of the last 2,000 years, China was one of the leading economies in the world, one of the leading civilizations, of course, on our planet for the last 2,000 years. And they had a horrible streak from 1839, when Britain invaded in the so-called First Opium Wars, through the end of the 19th century and all the European imperialists, then Japan as an imperialist power, and Japan's invasion in the 1930s, and civil war and disaster, and China ended up impoverished. So from 1980 onward, after Deng Xiaoping opened China to reform and to market economics, China started to develop from a base of extreme poverty. And I watched that process for 4 decades. I watched it very close up. I visited all parts of China. I studied the issues. I gave my analysis and suggestions of different things to do, but mostly I marvel at China's remarkable progress. Now, China today is still a poorer country per person than the United States, but since there are 1.4 billion people in China, even though China is perhaps 1/3 of the per capita gross domestic product of the United States measured in a particular way without getting into details, it still is a larger economy now in that measurement because called international dollars or international prices because it's got so many people. That's not a reason to panic. That's not a reason to say China's an enemy. I take note of the fact that in the last 40 years, while the US has been nonstop in war, China hasn't had one war beyond its borders during the last 40 years. So that's the aggressive country. We've been in Iraq, in Afghanistan, trying to overthrow the Syrian government, overthrowing the Libyan government. You name it. We bombed Belgrade. There are more than well over 100 military interventions that the United States has been engaged in since 1990. I think Tufts University scholars counted about 200 distinct military interventions. China, no. But we're the ones saying China's a danger, it's going to take over the world, and so forth. And by the way, there are countless reasons to understand that's not the point. The point is not that China's going to be the new unipolar power of the world. China has a lot of domestic development issues. China, like everybody, is suffering from climate change. China's rapidly aging. China's population is going to be in significant decline in the 21st century, by the way. According to the UN data, the population by the end of this century will have declined from today's 1.4 billion people, maybe to 800 million, if basically the current fertility patterns continue to hold. The point is, we have concocted a tale of fear. We have concocted a tale that I think they call China our pacing competitor. But basically, the newspapers say China's our enemy. We get to break every rule. We say we want a rule-based order, but we just put unilateral trade policies or unilateral sanctions or unilateral export bans on technology, all in violation of basic World Trade Organization standards. And we say that's because we defend the rules-based order. I've been around this a long time. This is a kind of a game of a narrative. The underlying purpose is that American foreign policy is based on the idea that America should be the predominant power. Our foreign policy strategists believe we can't be safe unless we are the most powerful. Now, what does that say about the other 192 countries in the UN? That safety doesn't apply or shouldn't be a consideration for them? The U.S. has a strange, not the U.S., these U.S. strategists, these U.S. neocons have a very strange idea about security. They have a very strange idea about American interests. They keep getting us into wars. They keep getting us into confrontations, which are extremely dangerous. Why did Speaker Nancy Pelosi fly to Taiwan in the middle of all these tensions when the Chinese said, please don't come. Please, this is not a good idea. Please don't raise tensions. Please abide by the one China policy. Please try not to let the temperatures get out of control. No, we have the right to go. I can go when I want. I'm Speaker of the House of the United States. There's no prudence, no sense. And we have a world of rising tension, by the way, which is not only a disaster for Ukraine and a threat for the world in so many ways, it's also terrible if you think maybe we should be doing something about climate change. Maybe we should be doing something about these long-term, really deep challenges. Maybe we should be helping poor people so the children can go to school or have health care. No, we need confrontation. And that's what bothers me. We are concocting these incredible dangers rather than talking to our counterparts.
Yes, yes. And you're an economist, Professor Sachs, and you have come out very firmly against sanctions. You were co-author of that landmark report on sanctions on Venezuela, and you've also talked a lot about sanctions on Syria. But sanctions has been a principal weapon in this aggressive posture the United States has taken toward, and the entire West really has taken toward Russia and China. Russia is now the most sanctioned country in the world, and China has been facing deeper and deeper sanctions on areas like high technology and, of course, on these human rights issues in Xinjiang, etc. Uh, could you talk about what are the impact of these sanctions in particular on Russia and China now on the entire global economy? What do you see their impact as being? And yeah, I just want to know generally your take on this form of economic warfare that the U.S. is leading toward these two major powers, rising powers in the world.
Well, first, just to be clear, the U.S. puts sanctions all over the place, and often it creates havoc for the countries involved. One of the biggest peacetime collapses in modern history is Venezuela because of the comprehensive U.S. sanctions, which crushed the oil sector of Venezuela and crushed the Venezuelan economy. The idea was very clear. The idea was to try to overthrow President Maduro. Well, I don't think that's a legitimate aim of foreign policy, period. Why does the U.S. use sanctions? Because it's just the stroke of a pen of the president. Because Congress isn't asked, the American people aren't asked, no one pays attention to this. The suffering that sanctions cause or the disruptions that they cause are not noticed. There's no direct outlays. There are no boots on the ground. So it's viewed as a freebie. But it's extraordinarily destructive. And in my understanding, with extensive discussions with international legal experts and human rights specialists, it's against international law, as it should be, because it's a unilateral action which is imposing extraordinarily high costs on others. Now, what it's doing in vis-a-vis Russia, ironically, is having a massive disruption of the world economy, probably hurting Europe. I don't know if it's right to say as much as it's hurting Russia, but a massive boomerang effect in Europe, because basically Europe traded with Russia. The United States calls it dependence on Russian energy. I call it trade. It's this the difference of economists and these geopolitical strategists. Europe was importing Russian natural gas and oil, and it was exporting other things to Russia. And the sanctions have broken all of that down, disrupted supply chains, directly impacting Europe, but we know also impacting the whole world. Suddenly fertilizer shortages, food price increases, incredibly volatile energy increases, big disruptions to the world natural gas markets. We've made a mess. The theory in the United States was this was going to cripple the Russian economy and end the Russia's war-making capacity. And I wrote on general principles, I have to say, not on any specific quantified model, but I wrote on general principles in the spring. Don't bet on it. These sanctions are very destructive, but they rarely have their intended outcomes. After all, we crushed the Venezuelan economy, but Maduro is there. Thank you very much. And now we're reopening relations because we want their oil suddenly. So this is typical U.S. policy. You do a huge amount of damage, you pay no attention, and you just go on. Another, by the way, set of sanctions is the United States grabbed the foreign exchange reserves of Afghanistan on the way out last year. Unbelievable. That's their foreign exchange reserves. We took their central bank's foreign exchange reserves, $8 billion, and the economy imploded. It was already in awful shape, but You can't run a country without a central bank, without foreign exchange reserves. But with the United States, hey, why not? No problem. That's typical.